Hello,
Hey,
I'm Alex,
and I'm Val.
and we are here for Season 5, Episode 9, Unidentified Blackmails,
Yeah,
written by Terrence Winter and Matthew Weiner, directed by Tim Van Patten, kind of a dream team of
super
Sopranos
team.
creation.
Mm-hmm.
It really shows. I feel like the combination of Terrence Winter and Matt Weiner is really something.
Yeah, no, this episode, I would put it in my top 10.
I would too.
It's really awesome.
Yeah, it's really incredible.
And when I think about season 5, I know that some of the events in this episode are like part of the season 5 arc. But I kind of forget that it's like all in one episode and a standout episode in that way, and kind of the way that all the different things are unified within this episode.
Totally.
So on this viewing, I'm really noticing those things.
There's also just scenes that were memorable for me.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like when I reflected on this show upon previous viewings, I remembered scenes like Finn and Meadows kind of late night exchanges, feeling kind of just like real to life in terms of representing that time in somebody's life, and kind of the dialogue feeling authentic. Dialogue just in general in this episode feeling authentic. I love the way that they kind of change the cadence and the vocabulary of characters from character to character.
They're so genius
that reflects
at writing.
like where people are, who they are. And then also just all the connective tissue in this episode is really amazing. There's so many subtle things going on at a writing level that just really kind of hammer home these themes and symbols that they're always working on the show, but in this very like sophisticated, mature way that I feel like it's taken the show a while to kind of get to this point where they've developed their own language, their own ideas, and their own way of communicating them.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting one in this episode surrounding the heat. And like characters being in these really hot environments.
Well, especially Finn is the one. I guess Meadow also in the house, but Finn going to the construction site where they talk about the heat often, his space being hot. Who are some of the other people or examples of that?
Well, a lot of them are surrounding those characters, like you were saying. Tony and Tony Blundetto, all in the beginning of the episode, are both sitting outside in the heat, and it's, it kind of sets them into this environment, whereas like Carmela, for example, in this episode is like wearing sweaters. She never looks like she's hot or seems like she's hot.
Interesting.
She doesn't sweat.
Even in that first scene, actually, between Tony Soprano and Tony Blundetto, Tony talking about like making grilled cheeses on the radiators in prison, like using heat in different ways.
Like the sound of fans, or like Vito having that fan, the fan in Meadow and Finn's apartment.
Right.
So there's like, for me, that's kind of new, and maybe we'll get into it a little bit more, but for me, that's kind of a newer symbol that I think as the next couple seasons come along, we get a little bit more into the heat. We have a lot more, and we had a little bit of like when Tony was down in Miami with that and the redness of that light, but I don't know. I start to think about hell whenever it's really hot. It also kind of like sets us in time. It's clearly summer. Finn's just graduated. There's this kind of like summer energy to this part of the episode, and it's interesting like what season that this season leaves off in, and where it starts.
Right. That is interesting because we're in a different season by the end.
Yes.
We are in a different season at the end of the season.
Yeah,
I stopped myself, but that is actually what I meant
said that
to
earlier.
say.
I was like, the season of the end of the season? Yeah.
That's actually exactly what we meant.
Yeah, so that is interesting in this season.
Seasons.
Which season it is. The other one is kind of this symbolism of rings and circles. And I think that's something that we've kind of interpreted, right? Like, by the way that the show is written, by the way that we like see and don't see characters based on how close they are to this like inner circle of the Soprano family. But we don't, at least like I haven't noticed before, and maybe some other viewers have noticed that, how the symbolism of these kind of circles, like talking about rings, for example. and kind of the power that those things hold. So
right.
Those are the two, like, you were talking about how they're, like, getting into their symbolism. I feel like they're actually, like, bringing out a lot of new symbolism.
Right. Yeah. No.
Which is amazing.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think you're right. I think that the show at this point has a distinctly different feel. Like, it's kind of going into new territory at this point. They are exploring new issues, new areas that haven't particularly been explored before, and that it feels different.
Yeah.
For me, the kind of like lifeblood of this episode is this concept of people not owning up for their own situations. That's the thing that kind of kept on coming back over and over. In fact, the title Unidentified Black Males kind of insinuates that, because there's multiple examples of people talking
using
about
them as scapegoats.
Yeah, people using unidentified black males as scapegoats. There's a lot of examples of that, be it Tony with his revelation on the panic attacks that we have at the very beginning. In fact, that's kind of like a book ending. At the very beginning, we have Tony Soprano and Tony Blundetto. Tony saying there's so many locked up making grilled cheeses, you'd think that there wouldn't be so many around, when Tony Blundetto is also using it as a scapegoat.
Yeah, for his foot.
For his foot. I mean, there is truly a lot. I mean, I'm trying to remember because I
they say something about it when Lil Polly's Eugene Pontecorvo bashes in Lil Polly's face.
That's right. They say, yeah, they were just running away and they were going to be able to blame it on them.
Yeah, exactly.
Immediately
there
after
was one
that,
other.
There's Meadow actually saying that when Finn says your ex was killed by, she's talking about confronting Meadow about not dealing with her ex being killed and the people that her family have associated with. Meadow says, well, actually, he was killed by drug dealers. African Americans, if you must know. Which is interesting because obviously we know all the details around that, and she hasn't accepted the reality of that situation. Even though she doesn't have the information, she has accepted a very convenient lie.
Yeah. Even I was thinking, like, they were when Tony was using the excuse of that he and Tony Blundetto were looking for Kelly. Mm-hmm. And they don't say a black guy that she's with, and this is I'm not saying anything whatsoever, but just because Meadow did say that, like they were drug dealers, I wonder if that was kind of insinuated with the Kelly story. Like they were using this as a scapegoat also for her.
Right. So speaking of scapegoats and people not kind of owning up to the situations they're in, their issues, and confronting them head on in the way that one would expect perhaps in therapy to actually deal with issues and move on. I'm going to go through sequentially because there are so many that happen in this episode. It's nuts. Like almost every main character that we have dealt with exhibits this in some way. So I'm going to start early on in the episode. We have Carmela waiting at home when Tony comes back and is going to come in. Carmela's actually kind of excited about her tryst with Tony.
Okay.
But, well, we kind of get that impression when she's talking to Gabriella.
I know. It's just that you called it a tryst.
A tryst. Is that not the right word?
No, it's fine.
But it's correct?
Yeah, sure.
Tryst? It's just nobody said that since, like, fucking, like
Shakespearean
Charlemagne conquered wherever the fuck he went. Yeah, okay, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Tryst. I dare say. Well, we have a situation where she's talking about how her reflections on this with Gabriella. And then there's some interesting shots there, actually, immediately after we see her face. She's actually kind of put together. She's wearing nice clothes, wearing makeup, knowing that Tony's coming. Gabrielle says, you should talk to him. There's some great shots, actually, on her face and then Tony's face as he just kind of leaves. AJ's face being oblivious to kind of seeing this triangle of where all those characters live. But the thing that happens right after that is Carmela saying, the last thing I needed was to talk. And Gabriella actually kind of rolls her eyes at that. So for me, there was kind of an example of Carmela does need to talk about this. They've just engaged in something that completely changes their situation, is obviously problematic because they're in the middle of divorce proceedings. But Carmela just kind of shrugs it off and kind of goes with the status quo. Very shortly after that, in fact, maybe even the next scene, we have Tony on the golf tee having a panic attack. Johnny saying basically these sudden changes of weather. So basically, like, blaming his panic attack on the weather in a way that isn't accurate.
He just needed electrolytes.
He just needed electrolytes. going on shortly, we have
I think it's the next scene also with Meadow and Finn.
let me just see here. We have actually, I have a different one. So what were you going to say?
Oh, just that whole scene where Finn is kind of making excuses for himself, like about getting a job, and he's like, I wouldn't want to take a job away from a minority. And
right.
And
yeah, actually, I didn't even write that one down. So, yeah.
And kind of like he's just kind of like lazing around. He's not really hustling to get a job.
Right.
And he has all these reasons why he hasn't.
Yeah. Shortly after that, we have Carmela actually saying, after all these years, can't you own up to anything more than these bullshit tax returns to Tony? So we have kind of like her actually confronting Tony at this moment on basically his inability to own up for things outside of what he's putting out there.
Yeah.
And he is unwilling to actually represent himself other than this facade.
Yeah. There's some other interesting things just quickly in that scene.
Yeah.
They talk about how, and this is when they're at the restaurant, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's some great heat language in that one. Tony's like, this is all on my sweat, right? Like that's how we got all this money, was on his sweat. And he talks about butter melting in your mouth.
Oh, interesting. Right.
But also, I liked the line where she was like, these guys live for that. And he says, so do I.
You think I don't? Yeah.
Yeah, so do I.
Right.
And I think anyways, just some great dialogue in that scene.
Yeah.
And they talk about the nuclear family.
All these things kind of end up interconnecting, which is really interesting. Like, people not dealing with their issues ends up impacting other people. And as time goes on, people's reactions and ways of living are all influenced and informed by these other people. So shortly after, we have Meadow and Carmela. Meadow, don't you want to live not dependent on some man?
Expecting things to be handed to them.
Right. So we have this whole conversation between Meadow and Carmela. Meadow ends up responding, it's simple for everyone, who isn't expecting things to be handed to them. Even Finn got a job working construction. So obviously that's not taking responsibility for the level of entitlement that she has.
Right. Well, her dad's paying her credit card.
Dad's paying her credit card. Finn got this job through connections.
Yeah.
Later on in the episode, we have Finn eating donuts on the site, taking a nap. I mean, to be able to throw this at her mom, saying that, like, Finn is this hardworking guy who deserved this and, like, went out of his way and through his own sweat got this, is rather preposterous. And it's an example of her not taking responsibility for all of the other things that are happening around them. Okay, so another one, going on to the tombstone of Peeps. Syl saying JC is dyslexic.
I think Jason.
Was it Jason? Oh, I thought it was JC.
I mean...
We didn't check the subtitles, but...
Yeah.
Okay, maybe it was Jason. That would make sense. But anyway, Tony's saying, well, what the fuck does that have to do with anything? Which is true. Like, why would him being dyslexic make him make that error?
Yeah.
It is. It's just like, it's scapegoating. Like, everybody is engaging this, and his name is Bavarelli.
Paparelli, because Peeps Paparelli.
Oh, okay.
Peeps.
I guess I should have put the subtitles on. I guess I can't hear things.
Maybe you can't hear.
Play too much music. But it's interesting. I mean, and then you have people calling others out on this behavior, like Tony saying to Syl, like, well, what does that have to do with anything? We have Carmela saying to Tony, can't you own up to these bullshit tax returns, or up to more than these bullshit tax returns? But people never do. People are constantly just having these scapegoats for themselves, and it makes things more convenient. Then obviously we have this huge Tony story about Tony Blendetto, and the one that you were mentioning, sorry, not the major one at the very end, but where he's saying that he was upstate, this alibi.
Yeah.
And that's also implying the fact that he puts his neck out in that way is kind of implies that he knows it was his cousin who was involved in the hit.
Yeah.
So he's not he's covering up, I guess.
Yeah.
But in a way, I mean, he's not really allowing the situation to be honest. And that's the other side of all these things, is that it's it's also a matter of nobody is engaging on an honest fashion. There's just so much duplicity and so much scapegoating around everybody's relationships that nothing is really real, and nobody can really grow or develop or self-actualize in a way, because everybody is just kind of in a constant position of bullshitting and blaming other people and not taking responsibility for things and changing. But
it's hard to imagine this world where that would be the case. Like, it's real. Like, what would be the implications of characters?
They can't.
Actually?
It's not even.
It's not possible.
That
for
idea
them.
of taking a moral inventory that's been brought up in this
Yeah.
season, it's just not really an option
Yeah.
because it's just too horrific.
Yeah.
Going on. I mean, there's just so many examples. Like Finn then saying, "Why don't we just get married?" It's another example of just avoiding the issues. They're in the middle of this huge fight. It seems like there's a lot of things that are pretty problematic for their relationship. Amongst them, Vito maybe wanting to kill or fuck him. That seems to be a big problem. But also where they are in life, their desires, and they're just completely glossing over it. And they're just in a position where they just basically choose this kind of like easy answer.
Yeah, I didn't write it down. Like,
I mean, it's not easy, but it's like, it's in the moment. It's like a cheap fix.
I know. Finn has these lines. I should have written them down about choices, right? Like Meadow says something about making a choice, and he was like, choices are just imposed on us by like the outside forces of some sort. I should have written it down.
Interesting.
But I think that is interesting. Finn's an interesting character. He's kind of like a I don't know, he's like a really kind of goofy character. But he does have some of these insights that I think are really interesting. Like he's at a level, like in terms of his connection to the Soprano family, that like I feel like we kind of like can see things through his eyes.
Right.
In some ways too. But he does talk about this like aspect of choices and like people making a choice. But I didn't write it down. So.
Yeah. It is interesting to think about that choice that he makes too. I mean, it's like right after falling asleep and not knowing anything, he's basically oscillating between breaking up and getting married for, in some ways, no other reason than to end the conversation and go to sleep. So,
yeah,
I
like that part. Like just again in terms of the heat thing, like it also feels like the heat is really exacerbating these characters' tensions, right? Like these could be things that they just kind of brush under the rug at any other time, but there's this like hotness to this episode, and like the fact that like before he actually said, like it's when Meadow goes into the bathroom, like they're having this fight, Meadow goes into the bathroom, he kicks this fan that's been the backtrack to their whole interactions this whole episode.
Yeah,
he kicks this fan and it makes this like clunking sound and it stops.
Sounds like it dies actually.
Yeah.
To me.
And that's when then she comes back and then he says, why don't we just get married?
Is interesting too, because I mean I guess that solves the problem of the fan, but it also provides no more support from the heat. So actually going forward, long term it's actually a much worse solution. You know what I mean? Like it's interesting in terms of reflecting the marriage proposal.
Yes, absolutely.
Whoa. Going on, I mean, so the other one that I thought was interesting is Tony in therapy. So that one's really fascinating because that's a position where Melfi actually confronts him in a way where she forces him to confront these lies that he's been telling himself.
Well, it's
and that's
just
kind
so
of
funny that he would even it's so interesting that he would even tell that lie to Melfi, who's the person he's going to for panic attacks, that he wouldn't tell her
and
that.
he blames her for panic attacks. He says, I would have thought that you would have fucking cured them.
Yeah.
So that's such a great example of him imposing these problems on somebody else, because that's all that he does. He says, at some point, like when Melfi says, go on, he says, no, it's not that. Like, I need some Pinot. And like Melfi is saying, like, no, you need to actually engage with this issue and discuss it and deal with it. But there's another example of Tony just trying to push it down, repress it, and drink some wine. It's like a vice, like anything else is.
Yeah, and then she offers him some water, and then we see him. And I think the next scene is when we see him in the pool, at the Soprano household. And I think the pool kind of is also this symbol and water. Again, we've talked a lot about water, but like that this is kind of like it's almost
it's showing up a lot in this season though. In particular, Tony in the pool.
Yeah, it's not curative. I don't want to put it at that, but it does like in some ways kind of like cool down. Like that's where Tony and Carmela were able to have this moment of their tryst, as you put it. That, I mean, but then again, she was thrown into the pool by Tony and AJ, so it's kind of like this forced, like, it's like this way to avoid feeling this heat and feeling these tensions come up in some way or something like that. I don't know. For me, there was something standing out about, like, Melfi offering him some water, him then being in the pool, and, like, he was, like, splashing himself with water, like, he was, like, putting water on himself.
The pool also kind of seems to be Tony's domain. Like we see, even in the pilot, we see him in the pool. At the beginning of this season, we see the pool closed as we start without him in this relationship. But like, for them to throw Carmela in there, there's something like there's about the power dynamic where Carmela is then thrown into his orbit again or his area of power.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like for me, like with the Soprano house in total, like that there is this like I said, like when they were in there in this episode, there was no sense at all that it was hot outside.
Right.
There is this kind of like coolness to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. There is something definitely this season for sure with like water's symbolized all sorts of things for us, and I don't know if I need to really sit with it and see if I can connect some of those elements as well, but maybe it's just different. Maybe there's something about water that is a different idea this season. Right.
Yeah, and I mean these symbols and metaphors are always changing.
Yeah.
It's constantly shifting. Okay, so I mean that's a lot. I feel like that's some examples of people being in situations where they're not owning up to how they're involved in issues around them and confronting them. And people have a lot of different techniques in Soprano world to repress these difficulties, to scapegoat them. And, we do have a lot of examples of people scapegoating them onto African Americans, which is interesting because I don't think we see any black people in this entire episode.
No.
Which is wild. I mean, it's like part of the problem is that this world is so white. It's like it's Italian dominated, but people don't even interact with people from that culture really.
Well, people don't interact with anyone outside their culture.
Yeah. Right.
They're in this not in this episode.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
No, not at all. I mean, but I was looking. I mean, you really don't see anybody, and it's so offensive.
Not even like at the construction site. I don't think I would have to look back, but
not a lot. I mean, I don't think anything. I couldn't see anything. And, for like Tony is using such racially charged, offensive, racist language, like in the end to be saying jigaboo cocksuckers to fictional villains that he invented. And he's still in a position where he can racially charge his scapegoating is so extreme. And that it's kind of like you were talking about how these characters can't confront these issues because they can't do a moral inventory. It is too horrible for these people. But like to take a step back, the fact that they're in some ways rationalizing what they do through these kind of like weird basic conservative values and like basically coming up with these like broad generalities about the role of African Americans in the US, like in the very beginning, Tony saying, like there's so many of them in jail and like these ideologies that are so simplistic and kind of so easily torn apart, but at the same time fuel everything that they do and fuels them rationalizing their actions and feeling better about themselves. Is something to comment on because they're not interacting with these people. They don't have any connection to them, and they're really predicated on lies. So,
no, I was just gonna say, like, even Finn, who comes across as like a pretty generic white guy, like his name is Finn,
right?
Like, and has that hair, and I love the reference to him as looking like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. He does. Like, I wish he would wear like bell bottoms, but I don't think we ever hear his last name until this episode, and which is I imagine, a somewhat Italian last name.
Right.
And so even he is in this circle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, even though he is this kind of like outsider, and terrified of what goes on inside there, he is part of that circle as well, and they treat him that way.
Mm-hmm.
Even like the circle of their lawn chairs, you know, like they always sit in this circle at the construction site.
Yeah, we're talking on Pi Day.
Is it Pi Day today?
Actually, no. Yesterday was Pi
yesterday.
Day.
Today's the Ides of March.
Oh wow. Not circle themes.
Pi symbolism. Yeah, like even he is part of that, right? And he's advantaged by his connection to that. And he then, like, you know, like I said, like he says, like, I wouldn't want to take a job away from a minority.
Right.
You're like, okay, Finn.
Right. Yeah, like that aspect of he's educated and maybe like understands some of these issues on a better level, and yet at the same time, like he's accepting
better, but
well, it's like a deeper level, I guess. I mean, it's less simplistic than Tony's kind of good and bad, black and white viewpoint. Yep. But at the same time, Finn is accepting handouts and not taking personal responsibility for how, you know, how he's getting what he's getting and how his life is kind of coming together. I mean, there's well, and even the choice for him to then propose marriage, like that's tightening your that's really bringing you into that circle, right? Like you're attaching yourself to that if he's,
family,
I mean, it's
right?
funny,
and it's like when Paulie comes up and he's like, my niece, blah blah, like tell her it's from Uncle Paulie,
right?
You know, he tries to pay for dinner with Tony, right? And Tony's like, do that with your own family,
right?
Not with mine, right? Like he's actively bringing himself into this world, which based on his experiences in this episode, I would feel like he would be relatively hesitant to do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was.
But he has a reason. Like he has some motivation for doing it.
Yeah,
it's not just Meadows' amazing smarts.
Yeah, that's an interesting scene actually near the beginning. Finn offering to pay for the meal, because that exposes like kind of the values of different people, and for Tony Soprano it is these kind of like traditional old world values, and there's an aspect of him using money as control too, because in some ways that's all he has. He engages in so much morally bankrupt behavior that he receives money and he can use it to buy basically people's support and friendship, and if you strip that away from him, really, what does he have? Nothing. He has absolutely nothing. And it's an interesting setting where it happens. It happens at this old homestead steakhouse, this classic steakhouse that's in Chelsea, from, I think, like the mid 1800s or like 1860s. King of beef. Like, for me, there's something even with that.
Something about that cow and then the pig on Satrials, even though we don't see.
Well, there's also a connection to like what Tony has already confronted in this show with Melfi, like his connections to meat, how that's relevant to him and violence. For him to be this king of beef, there's something there for me.
We see those like sizzling steaks come out in the cut from the scene with Tony B to the scene at the restaurant. Yeah, we enter the scene at the restaurant with these two sizzling steaks in front of us being carried by a waiter.
Which is something that we've been handheld to coming to a realization about, which is one of the few things in the show where they basically told us this is an association.
But it was also the heat. It was also the sizzling. It was also... Yeah. It's not cold meat like at Satrial's. Yeah. There was something different.
Yeah. Interesting. We have some other, actually, an interesting symbol that comes up very briefly that's kind of fascinating in this episode is the bear. Yeah. Very kind of underhanded treatment. Because it happens right as Carmela's on the phone with a lawyer who says, I'm going to have to recuse myself. I met with your husband. Edit to the bear. As she gets off the phone call, the bear leaves. That's it.
And she never sees the bear.
She never sees the bear. Exactly. And yet the bear is there.
Yeah.
And it's so closely linked to that conversation and the fact that Tony did go to these lawyers. Yeah. So, I mean, if anything, we were talking about the bear in the episode where the bear shows up earlier in this season. But, I mean, that really links Tony to the animal. It really kind of strengthens that connection and that symbolism.
Yeah. It's also that it's like rifling through the garbage.
Right.
which I feel like is like maybe like, I don't know, it's just my interpretation, but like the garbage left over from the party, you know, or something like that. Like that, like then this, like, because we do deal with like the repercussions of that tryst.
Yeah. Tryst.
in this episode. So I just, and yeah.
Yeah.
It's how do I say it? It's threatening. Like it seems like both characters, like both Tony and Carmela, kind of both saw it as this nice thing, and they both talk about that. Like Carm was pretty happy about it. Even Tony was like, it was nice, you know. Yeah. But it isn't. It kind of precipitates everything that happens in this episode.
Yeah.
You know, with the kind of the anger between the two of them surrounding money.
Yeah.
And that's really what it's about. Their anger towards each other at this point.
Yeah.
Like it's really focused on money. And I feel like, you know, it sucks for Carmela in some ways. Like she could never, like no lawyer's going to want to go into Tony Soprano's finances.
Yeah.
They're at huge risk to do that. I mean, even a lawyer representing Carmela is putting themselves at huge risk. But it's this, you know, it's the power that his violence has, but it's also the power that his money has for other people.
And it's interesting, too, because Carmela has that conversation with Meadow where she says to Meadow, you have options, I have a lawyer. And in the end, she loses her lawyer, right?
Yeah.
So her options versus lawyer
now she
comparison is interesting because by the end of the episode, she has nothing.
Yeah.
So if we look at the arc of character, something really happens for Carmela in the course of this episode. Actually, a lot of things happen for a lot of characters. If we were to look at where characters are at the beginning of this episode and the end, most characters are kind of in a new place, which is interesting. It doesn't feel like an episode where it's that heavy in terms of plot action, but it really is.
Oh, yeah.
It really is. It's amazing writing because so much happens in kind of a more subtle way than... well, any other show would treat it, that's for sure.
Yeah. No, there's a couple of things I kind of wanted to focus on in that sense. Like, I think, and we've talked about it a little bit already, but I think, like, the engagement of Meadow and Finn versus kind of the dissolution of the marriage between Tony and Carmela, which, again, both of those things occur in this episode, right? Like, Carmela actually goes to a lawyer and tells Tony, we're getting divorced.
Yeah.
Meadow and Finn go from almost breaking up to then getting married, but Carmela's reaction is also really interesting too, right? Like I love that her first words are you sure?" And her emotions are obviously really complicated and like amped up, and she's inside this house and Tony's outside in his pool splashing water on himself, and you know, Meadow and Finn seem really happy, but this proposal came during, like, at 4:23 in the morning or whatever it was. There was a time on the clock. I think it was 4:23, but that it was just kind of like, again, a scapegoat to end this fight. He's also using his graduation present to buy her a ring.
Wow, it's so amazing.
Yeah. Again,
yeah, that's the thing. Like the fact that Meadow would be like putting Finn up on a pedestal as this hardworking person who really fights for himself. Like nobody's really recognizing what they're getting in this situation and how they actually haven't done that much, and they're very fortunate to be given a lot of things. Yeah.
Yeah. The other part of this plot is kind of, and you know, is this not revelation, but is this truth telling that Tony does about the situation with Tony Blundetto? Because I think, is it even like hinted at before?
No. Oh, I mean, like the reality?
Yeah.
Not really. Other than the fact that Tony feels guilty.
Just the guilt. Yeah. So this is like a huge revelation in this episode. And I think it is interesting that this is something that, at least at this point in Tony's mental health, that this is really seems to be the thing that's really, like, Tony Blundetto is the thing that's kind of causing him these panic attacks, right? So like the guilt, but as well as, you know, like kind of his lack of control in some ways over him,
and also the fear of the implications of how he's acted against New York.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like how that impacts Tony. But then there's this other, and so I'll say that in a second, but I think like that revelation is going to stick with us throughout the next couple seasons as well. I forgot, like, this was like, I obviously remembered that was really the case, but I forgot that it was around. I thought for some reason Tony was younger when it happened. I think because they kept saying it was 17 years ago. I don't know. There was something like I for some reason thought they were kind of still teenagers, kind of like that story about when they, that with the card game, right? When they took down that card game. I kind of like saw it kind of happening more in that timeline. But what I didn't realize was that it happened when Meadow was 3 months old. Mm-hmm. And that Tony was kind of like defending Carmela against his mom. Yeah. They had this fight. And I'd kind of forgotten that element of it, and that there is something about, like there's something about like then like Tony being a dad and having this kind of responsibility. I guess Tony Blundetto was also a dad at the time too. Right. To Kelly. Yeah. Right. But like, there's something about that. And again, like the fact that then Kelly is also brought up as this scapegoat in some ways is interesting. Like comparing this Kelly, who we, sorry, spoiler, never meet or know about, to Meadow, and seeing kind of those different trajectories there. Yeah. But then the other thing that is brought up twice in the episode is Tony Blundetto's IQ. Right. And
158, very impressive.
It is. I mean, is that really his IQ? I'm not sure. But that is something I think that's really interesting, and I don't quite know what to make of it. But I know that it is linked to kind of like Tony's, I think just his guilt surrounding it, right? Like kind of this what if kind of thing. What if it had been him instead of Tony B, or what if neither of them had gotten caught, or what. So I think like, and it's kind of, again, like that's what I was kind of saying before, like with his kind of nervousness, his ability to kind of control Tony B, like Tony B's kind of out of his control, and he is smart, but Tony wasn't able to control him going and killing Joey Peeps. Right. So he like kind of wants to get him under his thumb a little bit, but I don't know if he really knows how. Right.
Yeah. Totally. Well, he has an interesting, there was an interesting line from Christopher in this episode that stuck out for me, where he was saying, Tony don't believe a person can change. And that's something that Tony said. So there's an interesting idea that's proposed in this episode too, that Tony is somebody who doesn't believe people can change, which is interesting because he's somebody in therapy. And I feel like one of the questions that this show poses is, can somebody change? Yep. And increasingly as time goes on, we get the feeling that no, they can't. But it's interesting that there's an example of that explicitly being stated in this episode. I can't think of it being stated before, but it's interesting to think about how Tony would be thinking of that information on Tony Blundetto. How would Tony Blundetto be changing from who he was back then, and what would he be expecting?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It is also interesting in terms of like Christopher saying that, right? Like, because Christopher is kind of saying like that he believes that he can change. Right.
Can he though? Do you think?
I don't know about old Chris.
Chris, we'll see. He seems to be doing great.
He likes frozen Snickers bars.
Does he? I didn't know that.
That's what he was eating. Well, that's what he says to Adriana. He says, "Did you even go to the store?" Right. And she's like,
frozen Snickers.
They don't say that, but she's like, I put them in the freezer like you like them. Yeah, and then we see him Snickers? Eating a I think it's a Snickers.
Oh, that's good. I didn't get that.
But also like him eating this frozen food. I don't know, the heat in this episode, I just really felt it. It was also like weirdly hot here today, so maybe I was...
Yeah, it was a hot Ides of March. Yeah. So yeah, I just had a few other stray observations. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots that we could talk about. But yeah, let's go through our stray stuff. They might bring up some stuff.
Well, one is just the multiple sides of characters that we see in this episode. For instance, on the construction site, Paulie, the two sides that he shows to Finn as he first shows up and is ordering Finn.
We haven't even talked about Vito yet. Oh, how are we doing stray observations?
That's a good point. There's a lot that happens in this episode. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll stray observations into Vito. How does that sound?
Aw.
How about I do my stray observation, and then we'll go straight into Vito because it's going to bring up Vito.
Okay.
So we have Polly ordering her on Finn. Polly finds out about Finn's relationship. He's a completely different person. So there is this kind of like black and white attitude from the mob where people are either basically
You're in or
monsters.
you're out.
You're in or you're out, and people are basically monsters to everyone except for the people in their circle.
Well,
and
they're
in their
also
family.
monsters to people in their circle, as we saw from
Right.
Eugene Pontecorvo.
Yeah.
And
Basically, if
Little
people
Polly.
don't, and also if people don't have something to give you, even if they are in your circle or can't benefit you, then they deserve to be the recipient of, monster behavior. So Polly shows that, and also Vito shows that. Like, Vito is very friendly to Finn, but then after Finn is a threat to him, is very menacing. Or not. I don't know. It's actually it's a little hard to read.
I love the writing on that.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
great.
All right, so we talk about Vito?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Vito.
take it. I'd be threatened. I don't think Finn is out of his.
Yeah, but like Vito seemed so sad when he didn't show up at the baseball game.
But there's also like the implications of what that means that he didn't show up. He could
well, I know he should have shown up. But he was dealing with this drama with Meadow. It was
Right.
it's really he definitely should have shown up.
Or
but-
should he have? I mean,
No, I mean like Vito invited him to a baseball game.
I don't think his intentions were that great.
But that's the thing. Like that's like that kind of like genius like
Ambiguity.
Except
it's not because it's clearly related to Finn seeing him.
I don't. But like then like they wouldn't have shown us his reaction like that. And that
Yeah.
scene where he is outside of the bathroom with Finn, like, or the porta potty with Finn, it is kind of ambiguous. Like he is clear, like he's acknowledging that Finn saw that, and he is in some ways being menacing. But I don't think that that's his only.
I think
thing.
It's.
I don't think he wants to have sex with Finn. I don't.
No,
I don't read
I don't
that
think
at all.
that is
And,
accurate.
and Finn just doesn't really have any.
No, I don't think that is accurate.
But I also like I don't think that it's I think he does still see him as like this insider, and he wants to like keep him in this very secretive circle.
It's interesting, yeah, and maybe there's multiple techniques for that, and we don't know Vito, which is interesting about this development because Vito is now being introduced as kind of like a major part of the ensemble for the first time. So we're learning about different sides of him as a character, and you're right, like he just needs to make sure that this doesn't come out, and I guess he could do that through fear, or he could do that through bringing flies through honey or whatever, by like being super nice to him and like
Flies through honey.
Flies through honey, that famous. It's late. but yeah, I mean, there's also another technique where he can basically just kind of like give him stuff and kind of which seems to work for other people in the orbit. Like we've seen it work for Carmella in some ways, where she gets stuff and it kind of buys you off from challenging.
We also know that Vito has killed other of Meadow's boyfriends before.
Right.
So
which is interesting given the discussions that happened in this episode.
We're a little suspicious of him.
Between Meadow and
Finn. The big plot revelation that carries us into the next seasons as well is Vito and the security guard.
Mm-hmm.
And
and again that's a major plot development.
Yeah, it's huge. Also, like related back to when why Lil Polly gets his face beaten by Eugene Pontecorvo is that he insinuated that Eugene was gay, right? And they were all kind of joking around. So we know that this is a really big thing in the mafia, and there's been references to it before, But yeah, Vito.
Yeah.
And I don't know, and it's interesting, them all they talk about their, they're all talking about their Gumars. There is this kind of currency of having a relationship. There's that character Felicia,
right,
who Finn looks at her underwear.
Right, he does look at her underwear. That's true.
But yeah, sorry. So Vito. Now we can continue with stray observations. If you'd like.
Okay, you get it. Your turn. Stray observation.
My stray observation number 1 is that there were 2 references to Canada in this episode. So we're Canadian.
We are Canadian.
Someone emailed us and asked
That's right.
and asked us if we were Canadian. And
apparently they had a bet with their friends who were listening, and some of them thought that we were from Minnesota.
but we're not. We're from
We're
Canada.
not. We're from Canada.
But we live in New York. There was references to the Blue Jays.
There was references.
Baseball
It's
team.
very quick, but I'll take it.
And then also, Hunter Scancarello is living in Montreal.
Very cool stuff.
So,
I wonder if she's at McGill.
I don't know. Or she has a French roommate or something. So
Yep.
that's number one for me.
We like that.
I like it. What else have you got?
Mine is like bleaker and more like just the idea of Tony saying in his therapy, if Carmela woke up before I left, it would send mixed signals. And then Melfi basically taking that information and saying, well, I'm not sure if that's a good idea. And then she gets cut off by Tony taking a phone call. And then there's an edit, and we actually leave that scene. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's another example. I mean, Tony's clearly engaging in horrible behavior, and he's not re-engaging in this relationship in a healthy, productive way that doesn't give any power to Carmela. He's basically stripping her in so many senses of power in this episode. But then also, as the episode continues and he's dealing with it, he just represses the whole thing.
Yeah.
And basically just exerts his power, doesn't want to talk about it in therapy. And for us as viewers, we don't even get to engage in a deconstruction of that topic. It just goes away.
I know. I wrote that one down too because that stood out for me. And I was going to mention it before, even when we were talking about scapegoats, like that this phone call was also kind of a way for Tony to like escape that conversation, like to kind of like...
Yeah, it's another,
at least,
a great example.
At least deflect, I don't know,
yeah.
like, onto that. I love when Johnny Sack gets crazy.
Oh, man.
I love when he
gets
starts
so
talking
crazy.
about, like, he's like, I'm going to kill him and his wife and your cousin. Like, he's just, like, going nuts. I love when he gets that crazy.
Yeah.
He is so crazy. All I have is Johnny Sack is crazy, killing everyone. And then I love how everyone at that scene at the funeral for Joey Peeps, like that it's raining. Again, it's kind of this like cooling, like it's this cooling energy, but things are really kind of heating up there. But everyone puts up their umbrellas at the end, and they're all looking over at Tony and Johnny Sack when they're talking, and then they go into the car.
Right.
And then they come out of the car, and both of them look at Tony Blindetto.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't know, just like really, the tension in there is really cool.
Yeah. No, totally.
We also find out that Robin Sanseverino has a kid, and she told Adriana.
And she's sassy.
And her kid is sassy. And she had told Adriana that she doesn't have kids.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I missed that. Oh, yeah.
We also have that scene on the beach.
When did she tell Adriana that she doesn't have kids?
Adriana asked her if she had kids, and she said no.
In which episode? Do you remember? It was this season,
This season.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
We have a weird conversation. The only actually minority character we see in this episode, it seems to be some kind of boyfriend of Meadows' roommate, the princess. And they're at the beach. I think her name is Alex. And they're at the beach, and they talk about him going into the CIA.
Right.
And then he says that instead he's going to go to film school.
Right.
And Finn's Finn's disturbed by this. Like, Finn's actually, like, that's when Finn then gets up and leaves.
Oh, interesting.
And there is this tension.
No, that's good.
There is this tension for Finn, and we kind of laugh at it because it's really funny, actually, that he has this, like, going to dental school thing.
Yeah.
But he also has this interest in photography and
Right.
in art.
Which we know wouldn't be appreciated or supported by the people.
By
from
anybody
Sopranos
in this,
family.
and probably not by his own family either. It seems, right?
We'd appreciate it. We'd like it.
We would, but then it was interesting, like, and then of course, like that someone said his photos have.
What was it?
Like, oh, I can't think of the
sentimentality
line.
or something like
No,
a
like
detached,
a complete lack of
like a detached sentimentalism or something. Yeah.
But it's interesting their apartment, and I don't really know if I noticed this before, but at least their bedroom. Maybe we haven't seen their bedroom before. It is painted this like very deep color, almost like a greenish blue.
Okay.
And the art on their walls is all like
Posters.
art posters.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting to think about this, like, I don't know, like for less so for Meadow, but like maybe like the people who are surrounding them, this kind of like tension between these like privileged privileged positions that they have access to, but then kind of feeling drawn towards these more artistic careers, but not really having the depth to be able to access them. So like for me, that was the thing with like the art posters and Finn's photography.
And maybe like fear too, because there is just no support from the people around them. They can't receive that.
Yeah. Anyways, there was something with that. I'm gonna keep paying attention to it. Let's see. I'm looking. I like the scene where Carmela throws all her groceries on the floor.
Hear
There's
glass
like a
break.
Smash. Yep. And that's all I've got.
That's great. Well, I love that episode. It's an amazing episode.
Me too.
The writing is top notch.
It's just like so. I mean, each character, like you
Actually,
really.
directing too. There's some good
you
stuff.
just really believe each character's dialogue, and that these are really things that they would say, like Meadow and Finn being so pretentious. Other characters not being so pretentious.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, I mean, season 5 at this point is really kind of coming into its own as a winning season for me around now.
Yeah. Well, the next couple episodes we've got are really something.
They're really cool. So, if you like cool stuff, keep watching The Sopranos.
Yeah.
And listen to our show.
If you like our little talk.
Yeah.
Then you can email us. And
Please
we like to
say where you think. Well, we just told you where we're from, but we're not from Minnesota. If you have any betting pools, let us know.
But also email us. We actually we feel really fortunate. There's a couple people who have emailed us, and we actually get to engage in like longer conversations over email.
It's great,
and it's really fun for us. So
yeah. So we'll talk to you then. And
when?
If you email us.
Oh, yeah. We'll talk to you if you email us. And if not, then you'll hear our voices next episode.
Yeah. See you then.
Bye.
Bye.